My wife Jessica discovered some TikTok influencer talking about radical transparency in relationships and decided this was going to revolutionize our marriage. She came home from her book club meeting, practically vibrating with excitement about this new concept she'd learned about. We need to start being completely transparent with each other about everything, she announced over dinner, waving her fork around for emphasis. No more filtering our thoughts or protecting each other's feelings. Just pure, honest communication about everything. I told her we already shared the important stuff and that some thoughts were probably better kept private for everyone's sanity. But she rolled her eyes dramatically and said I was being emotionally unavailable, that my resistance to vulnerability proved we needed this policy even more than she'd initially thought. That's exactly the kind of toxic masculine energy that keeps couples from achieving true intimacy, she said, pulling up the TikTok video on her phone to show me. Look at how happy this couple looks after implementing radical transparency. Real partners don't hide anything from each other. The video showed some couple in matching athleisure outfits talking about how sharing every thought had transformed their relationship. They looked like they were auditioning for a supplement commercial, all white teeth and perfect lighting. I tried explaining that everyone needs some mental privacy, that brutal honesty could damage more than it helped, and that successful relationships required boundaries, not unlimited access to each other's inner monologue. She got defensive immediately and accused me of having secrets, saying my reluctance to be completely vulnerable showed I didn't trust her with my authentic self. She said she was disappointed that after 5 years of marriage, I still didn't feel safe being completely open with her. What are you hiding from me? She asked, leaning forward with that intense look she got when she thought she was onto something important. Why are you so scared of letting me see who you really are? For a solid week, she brought up radical transparency every single day. She forwarded me articles about emotional authenticity and left books about vulnerable communication on my nightstand. She'd pause whatever we were watching to point out how the characters needed better communication, then stare at me meaningfully until I nodded in agreement. She started analyzing every conversation we had through the lens of radical transparency. If I didn't immediately share my reaction to something, she'd ask why I was withholding my authentic response. If I mentioned being tired, she'd want to know exactly what was making me tired and why I hadn't shared those specific stresses earlier. The fact that you're resisting this so hard proves how much we need it, she said during one of our increasingly frequent discussions about the topic. Healthy couples don't fear honesty. Healthy couples crave it. She bought 5 different books about radical honesty and emotional transparency, leaving them strategically placed around the house with specific pages bookmarked. I'd find highlighted passages about toxic communication patterns and relationship authenticity everywhere I looked. The final straw came when she woke me up at 11:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night to discuss an article she'd found about how resistance to vulnerability was actually a form of emotional abuse. She'd been lying there reading relationship blogs on her phone and had apparently found something that convinced her my hesitation was a serious red flag. I need to know that you're willing to be completely honest with me, she said, sitting cross-legged on the bed with her laptop open. This article says that partners who refuse transparency are usually hiding something significant. I was exhausted from a 12-hour workday and just wanted to sleep, but she kept reading excerpts from various relationship experts about the importance of radical honesty in building trust and intimacy. Fine, I finally said when she started a 4th article about emotional availability. You want complete transparency? We'll do complete transparency, but don't complain when you get exactly what you're asking for. She actually clapped her hands together like a kid on Christmas morning and said this would transform our relationship and bring us closer than we'd ever been. She was practically glowing with satisfaction that she'd finally convinced me to embrace this new level of communication. This is going to be amazing, she said, snuggling up next to me. We're going to have the kind of relationship other people are jealous of. Complete honesty, total trust, absolute transparency about everything. I should have known right then that she had no idea what she was actually asking for. The next morning, she was practically bouncing around the kitchen making coffee and toast, clearly excited to start our new transparency policy. She asked why I'd seemed quiet during her sister Rachel's birthday party the previous weekend. I figured this was as good a time as any to give her the radical honesty she'd been demanding. Because Rachel spent the entire night humble bragging about her promotion while systematically putting down everyone else's career choices, I said while buttering my toast. And you encouraged her behavior because you're jealous of her success, but too insecure to admit it, so you try to stay on her good side by validating her need to feel superior. Jessica's coffee mug froze halfway to her mouth as she processed what I just said. Her face went through several expressions before settling on shocked confusion. That seems unnecessarily harsh, she started to say, but I reminded her that harsh truths were exactly what she'd been demanding for a week straight. Also, your mom spent 20 minutes making passive-aggressive comments about my career, my clothes, and the gift I brought, but everyone pretended not to notice. Because that's what your family does with uncomfortable truths, I continued, spreading jam while maintaining eye contact. Jessica was staring at me like she'd never seen me before, clearly not expecting me to actually follow through on the transparency thing quite this thoroughly. Your dad explained cryptocurrency to me for 45 minutes, even though he lost $18,000 on various coins last year, which I know because you showed me his trading app when you were worried about their retirement savings, I said, taking a bite of toast. He needs to feel intellectually superior to compensate for making terrible financial decisions. She started to argue that I was being mean and that this wasn't what she'd meant by transparency, but I kept going with the brutal honesty she'd specifically requested. And your brother spent half the party complaining about his job, but when I suggested he look for something else, you kicked me under the table because you know he's too lazy to actually change his situation, and you didn't want me pointing that out in front of everyone. Jessica was opening and closing her mouth like a fish, clearly struggling to process this level of unfiltered honesty about her family dynamics. That afternoon, our neighbor Brad came over to borrow my leaf blower and made the mistake of asking how married life was treating us. Jessica, still trying to prove she was committed to our new transparency policy, actually bragged about how evolved our communication had become. "We've started practicing radical transparency," she announced proudly. "We're being completely honest with each other about everything. No more filtering or protecting each other's feelings. It's already bringing us so much closer." Brad looked impressed and said that sounded really healthy, that more couples should have that kind of open communication. "Since we're being transparent, Brad, you should know that Jessica only tolerates your weekly visits because your wife always brings expensive wine to neighborhood gatherings and you fix appliances for people without charging labor," I said while handing him the leaf blower. Brad's face went from friendly to confused as he tried to figure out if this was some kind of joke. "She thinks you're boring and talk too much about sports, but you're useful to have around the block, so she pretends to be interested in your stories about work," I continued with the radical honesty Jessica had demanded. Jessica was frantically shaking her head and trying to laugh it off, but I reminded her that lies and social niceties weren't part of radical transparency. "And that promotion at the manufacturing plant you've been celebrating for 3 months? Jessica looked up your company online because she was curious about your salary and discovered it's just a title change with no increase in pay because they're trying to push out higher paid senior employees without technically firing them." Brad's face went red as he looked back and forth between us, clearly trying to process what was happening. Jessica was making desperate hand gestures behind him, but I just smiled and continued being radically transparent. "The company figures if they give older employees fancy titles, but no real authority or salary increases, they'll eventually get frustrated and quit on their own, saving the company from paying unemployment benefits or facing age discrimination lawsuits." Brad stood there holding the leaf blower for another 10 seconds before mumbling something about needing to get back to yard work and practically running back to his house. Jessica chased after him, trying to explain that I was just having some kind of episode and didn't mean any of it. When she came back inside, she was furious and accused me of deliberately embarrassing her and ruining her relationship with the neighbors. "This isn't what I meant by transparency," she said, following me around the kitchen as I cleaned up lunch dishes. "You're being cruel and vindictive, not honest and vulnerable." I reminded her that she'd specifically demanded brutal honesty about everything, not just the comfortable truths that made her feel good about our relationship. Thursday night was the monthly dinner with her parents at the retirement community where her mother lived since her father's stroke 2 years earlier. Her mother always made sure everyone knew how well her children were doing, how proud she was of their marriages and careers. When her father started his usual speech about the importance of hard work and family values, I decided radical transparency should apply to all our relationships, not just our marriage. Speaking of family values, it's interesting you mentioned those when Jessica discovered last month that you've been taking money from both kids' college savings accounts to pay for your gambling trips to the reservation casino, I said while cutting my pot roast. The entire table went silent. Jessica's mother dropped her fork, making a loud clanging sound that seemed to echo through the dining room. Her father's face turned purple as he struggled to find words. Jessica kicked me hard under the table, but I was just following the transparency rules she'd established. "She found the bank transfers when she was helping with your taxes," I continued, meeting her father's increasingly panicked gaze. You've been borrowing from their accounts for almost 2 years to cover gambling debts, then transferring money back when you occasionally win to make the balances look normal. Jessica's mother started hyperventilating, while other residents at nearby tables began turning to stare at our family drama unfolding in real time. Jessica didn't say anything because she didn't want to upset your mother, but you've stolen over $30,000 from your grandchildren's education funds to feed your gambling addiction, I said, taking another bite of pot roast like I was discussing the weather. Her father tried to deny everything, but I pulled out Jessica's phone and showed him the screenshots she'd taken of the suspicious transfers. Her mother grabbed the phone with shaking hands, scrolling through months of evidence while tears started streaming down her face. The retirement community dining room had gone completely quiet, except for the sound of Jessica's mother crying, and her father trying to make excuses about short-term loans and investment strategies. By Friday morning, Jessica was practically begging me to stop the radical transparency policy. She said I'd misunderstood what she meant and was being deliberately destructive instead of trying to build intimacy. You wanted brutal honesty about everything, I said while she cried on the living room couch. But you only wanted the kind of honesty that made you feel closer to me, not the kind that revealed uncomfortable truths about your family and friends. She accused me of weaponizing her desire for better communication, of turning something beautiful into a tool for causing pain. You thought I'd share my deepest insecurities and fears so you could feel needed and important, I continued. You wanted me to be vulnerable so you could play therapist and feel emotionally superior, but you never considered what I actually think about your behavior patterns. She was sobbing now, saying I was destroying every relationship she cared about, just to prove a point. I sat down next to her on the couch and took her hand gently, looking into her eyes with complete sincerity as her phone buzzed with yet another call from her mother. Your parents aren't just fighting about the gambling money, I said softly. They're fighting because your mother found text messages between your father and a woman named Linda from his physical therapy sessions. She's been calling because she needs someone to talk to about the affair. Jessica snatched her phone so fast I barely saw her move, reading the messages from her mother with shaking hands. Her face went pale as she scrolled through photos her mom had sent of text exchanges and credit card statements showing hotel charges and restaurant bills for 2 people. She started typing responses with trembling fingers, trying to comfort her mother while processing this new information about her father's betrayal. The phone kept buzzing with more details about lies and deception that had apparently been going on for months while Jessica's mother had been living in denial. That weekend, Jessica's sister Rachel called crying because word had somehow gotten out about her fake promotion. Apparently, Brad had been so upset about being humiliated that he told his wife everything, and she'd shared the story at their book club meeting. Within days, the gossip had spread through their social circle, and someone who worked at Rachel's company had confirmed that the promotion was indeed just a title change with no salary increase or additional authority. Rachel was mortified and blamed Jessica for sharing confidential information that had destroyed her professional reputation. She accused Jessica of being jealous and vindictive, of deliberately sabotaging her success. Jessica tried to explain about our transparency experiment, but Rachel hung up on her before she could finish her explanation. Our neighbors had clearly been talking about the leaf blower incident because suddenly nobody was waving when they saw us in the yard. The weekly block party invitations mysteriously stopped coming, and Jessica's usual walking partners became unavailable for their morning exercise routine. During our Saturday grocery shopping trip, I continued the radical transparency Jessica had demanded. When the cashier made small talk about the weather, I mentioned that Jessica thought she was flirting with me and always made rude comments about her appearance on the drive home. That's what radical transparency looks like, I reminded Jessica when she tried to stop me. Complete honesty in all our interactions, not just the private ones. At the pharmacy while Jessica was picking up her anxiety medication, I told the pharmacist that she'd been researching psychiatric drugs online because she was convinced everyone judged her for needing mental health support. Jessica ran out of the store crying while I paid for her prescription, then confronted me in the parking lot about humiliating her in public. "This is what you asked for," I said calmly, unlocking the car. Radical transparency in all aspects of our lives. You can't pick and choose when honesty applies based on your comfort level. The following week, Jessica's mother called asking if we could meet for coffee because she needed someone to talk to about filing for divorce. Jessica agreed, thinking it might help repair their relationship after the disastrous dinner revelation. We met at a downtown coffee shop where Jessica's mother looked like she'd aged 5 years in 5 days. She started crying immediately and asked how long I'd known about her husband's gambling and affair. Jessica's known about the financial problems for 8 months, I said while her mother stirred her coffee with shaking hands. She discovered the bank transfers when she was helping with your tax preparation last spring. Jessica's mother stared at her in complete shock, asking why she'd never said anything about such serious problems. She found out about Linda 3 weeks ago when your husband accidentally left his phone unlocked at our house, I continued, maintaining the brutal honesty Jessica had demanded. She saw the text messages and photos, but decided not to tell you because she thought it would be too devastating. Jessica's mother's voice got louder as she processed this information. You've been watching me live in denial for months while my husband was stealing from our grandchildren and cheating with his physical therapist. Jessica tried to explain that she'd wanted to protect her mother, that she'd hoped the problems would resolve themselves somehow, but her mother was too angry to listen. You let me defend him when the bank called about unusual account activity, her mother said, standing up abruptly. You watched me make excuses for his behavior and said absolutely nothing. She gathered her purse and left the coffee shop without another word, leaving Jessica sobbing at the table while other customers stared at our family drama. That night, Jessica packed a suitcase and announced she was going to stay with her friend Monica for a few days because she needed space to think about our marriage. You've destroyed every relationship I care about, she said while throwing clothes into her bag. You turned my request for better communication into a campaign of psychological warfare. I reminded her that she'd literally demanded radical transparency for over a week, buying books and articles and TikTok videos about authentic communication in relationships. You wanted me to be vulnerable and open, I said while she cried, but you only wanted vulnerability that made you feel closer to me, not honesty that made you uncomfortable with your own behavior patterns. She left that night, and I didn't hear from her for 3 days. While Jessica was gone, her father showed up at our house at 2 a.m., clearly drunk and furious about the dinner revelations. He pounded on the front door, screaming about how I destroyed his family and turned his daughter against him. I called the police, but he kept yelling from the front lawn about lawsuits and defamation until the officers arrived and convinced him to go home. Several neighbors came out to watch the spectacle, which I'm sure didn't help Jessica's reputation in our subdivision. The next morning, Monica called asking if the things Jessica had told her about our transparency experiment were actually true. She said Jessica was having panic attacks and couldn't stop crying about losing everyone she loved. I explained that Jessica had demanded complete honesty in our relationship, and I'd simply given her exactly what she'd requested. Monica said I was being cruel and vindictive, that no one could survive that level of brutal truth-telling. Maybe that's the point, I said. Maybe relationships aren't supposed to survive unlimited honesty. Maybe boundaries exist for good reasons. 2 days later, Jessica came home looking exhausted and defeated. She said she wanted to try couples therapy to save our marriage, but only if I agreed to stop the transparency policy immediately. The whole point was that you demanded this, I reminded her. You can't just turn it off when you don't like the results. That's not how radical transparency works according to all those books you bought. She begged me to understand that she'd made a mistake, that she'd never intended for things to go this far or cause this much damage. But I reminded her that honesty isn't conditional. Either we're completely transparent about everything, or we're not. There's no middle ground in radical transparency. The next week, we sat in Dr. Martinez's office for our first couples therapy session. The waiting room smelled like lavender and had those white noise machines that were supposed to be calming, but just made everything feel more tense. Jessica spent the first 45 minutes explaining to Dr. Martinez how I twisted her request for better communication into a systematic campaign of psychological warfare against her entire family and social circle. She described in detail how I destroyed her relationships with her parents, her sister, her neighbors, and her friends by revealing private information and harsh judgments under the guise of following her transparency policy. Dr. Martinez listened without interrupting, occasionally taking notes, then asked Jessica to explain what she'd hoped to achieve with radical transparency in the first place. Jessica struggled to articulate her goals beyond saying she'd wanted us to be closer and more emotionally connected. She couldn't really explain why she thought brutal honesty would accomplish those relationship goals. I just felt like he was holding back from me, she said, twisting her wedding ring nervously, like there was this wall between us that I couldn't break through. I thought if we could just be completely honest about everything, we'd finally have the kind of intimacy I see other couples have. Dr. Martinez asked why Jessica had been demanding transparency from me when she'd been keeping major secrets about her parents' financial and marital problems for months. Jessica's face flushed red as she tried to justify hiding information to protect people, but she couldn't explain why that was different from the privacy boundaries I'd originally wanted to maintain. So transparency was only supposed to flow in one direction? Dr. Martinez asked directly. He was supposed to share everything with you while you decided what information other people could handle? Jessica started crying and said she'd never thought about it that way, that she just wanted to feel closer to me and more secure in our relationship. Dr. Martinez pointed out that Jessica had used emotional manipulation and pressure tactics to coerce me into something I'd explicitly said I was uncomfortable with. When Jessica tried to argue that it wasn't the same thing, Dr. Martinez asked her to consider how she would respond if I had spent a week pressuring her to engage in some sexual activity she'd said she wasn't interested in. The comparison made Jessica angry, and she said that wasn't the same thing at all, that emotional intimacy was different from physical intimacy. But Dr. Martinez explained that consent applies to emotional vulnerability just as much as physical vulnerability, and that Jessica had violated my clearly expressed boundaries repeatedly over the course of a week. You used guilt, manipulation, and emotional pressure to wear down his resistance, Dr. Martinez said, matter-of-factly. That's coercion, regardless of your intentions. Over the next several weeks, Jessica's world continued falling apart as the consequences of our transparency experiment rippled outward. Her mother had filed for divorce and was refusing to speak to Jessica, saying she felt completely betrayed by months of lies by omission about serious family problems. Rachel's marriage was struggling because her husband had found out about the fake promotion and was now questioning what else she'd been lying about regarding her career success and financial situation. Jessica's entire friend group had ostracized her after Monica shared details about our transparency experiment. They thought Jessica was having some kind of mental breakdown and didn't want to be involved in the drama. Her work performance was suffering as she tried to deal with the emotional fallout from destroyed relationships. Her supervisor had pulled her aside twice to ask if everything was okay at home because she'd been distracted and tearful during important meetings. Jessica couldn't explain the situation without sounding completely unstable, so she just said she was going through a difficult personal situation and hoped things would improve soon. During our individual therapy sessions, Dr. Martinez helped me understand that Jessica's demand for transparency had actually been a sophisticated form of emotional control disguised as a desire for intimacy. She'd wanted unlimited access to my private thoughts and feelings without having to reciprocate with her own difficult truths or uncomfortable revelations. When I'd given her actual radical transparency instead of the selective vulnerability she'd been expecting, she couldn't handle the reality of what complete honesty actually meant in practice. Dr. Martinez explained that healthy relationships require boundaries and privacy, not unlimited transparency. She said privacy isn't the same as secrecy or deception. Everyone needs mental and emotional space that belongs exclusively to them. Demanding access to your partner's every thought and feeling is actually a form of emotional invasion, she told me during one session. It's not intimacy, it's control. Meanwhile, Jessica was dealing with increasingly serious consequences from our experiment. Her parents' divorce was getting ugly, with her father claiming that Jessica and her mother had conspired to destroy his reputation over minor financial mistakes. Her mother had moved in with Jessica's sister and was telling everyone who would listen about the gambling addiction and the affair with Linda from physical therapy. The retirement community where her father still lived was buzzing with gossip about the scandal, and several of his friends had stopped speaking to him entirely. Jessica felt completely responsible for destroying her family, but Dr. Martinez helped her understand during our joint sessions that she'd only revealed problems that had already existed for years. Her father's gambling, financial deception, and affair weren't caused by our transparency experiment. They were long-standing issues that had been hidden beneath a surface of denial and avoidance. At work, Jessica's situation got worse when her boss called her into his office for a formal discussion about her declining performance and increased absences. She'd been taking time off to deal with family crises and had been making mistakes on important projects because she couldn't concentrate on anything besides the relationship disasters. When her boss asked directly if she was dealing with substance abuse or mental health issues, Jessica broke down crying and had to be sent home for the rest of the week. 3 months after our transparency experiment had begun, Jessica's mother surprised everyone by reaching out to ask if we could meet for lunch. She looked healthier and more relaxed than I'd seen her in years, and she said the divorce proceedings were moving forward smoothly. "I wanted to thank you for finally telling me the truth about my husband," she said over salad and soup. "It was devastating at the time, but living in denial was slowly killing me." She'd started seeing a therapist who had helped her understand that her husband's behavior had been escalating for years, and that the gambling debts and affair were just the most recent examples of a long pattern of deception and betrayal. "I wasted 30 years pretending everything was fine when I knew deep down that something was seriously wrong," she continued. "Watching you stand up to Jessica gave me permission to finally stop pretending and start living authentically." Jessica cried with relief that her mother had forgiven her, but her mother explained that forgiveness was different from trust, and that it would take time to rebuild their relationship after months of complicity in her father's lies. Around the same time, Brad approached me while I was mowing the lawn one Saturday morning. He looked embarrassed but determined to have a conversation about the leaf blower incident. "I wanted to thank you for the reality check about my job situation," he said, standing awkwardly by our mailbox. "It was humiliating at the time, but you probably saved me from years of additional frustration and disappointment." He'd confronted his supervisor about the promotion and had learned that the company was indeed trying to phase out higher-paid senior employees through a combination of title changes, increased workload, and decreased actual authority. Instead of waiting to be pushed out, he'd found a better position with a competitor that actually valued his experience and was paying him significantly more than his previous salary. His wife had been initially angry about the public humiliation, but had eventually admitted that she was relieved to stop pretending his fake promotion was something worth celebrating. "You forced me to face a truth I'd been avoiding," Brad said, "and now my whole family is in a better position because of it." In therapy, Jessica finally began to acknowledge that her demand for transparency had been fundamentally selfish and manipulative rather than relationship building. She'd wanted me to be vulnerable and open without being willing to face difficult truths about herself, her family, or her own behavior patterns. Dr. Martinez helped her understand that true intimacy comes from mutual respect for boundaries, not from demanding unlimited access to private thoughts and feelings. Jessica started working on her tendency to use emotional manipulation to control situations and relationships. She recognized that pressuring me for a week had been a form of coercion disguised as a desire for better communication. Over several months of individual and couples therapy, we slowly began developing actual healthy transparency about issues that genuinely mattered. Our feelings about the relationship, our individual needs and concerns, our hopes and fears about the future. But we also learned to maintain appropriate privacy about random thoughts, passing judgments, and personal processing that didn't need to be shared with anyone else. Jessica learned to tolerate not knowing every detail of my inner world, and I learned to share more of my genuine feelings without the artificial pressure of radical honesty policies. Her relationship with her family gradually improved as everyone adjusted to their new reality. Her father had entered a gambling addiction treatment program as part of the divorce settlement, though their relationship remained strained and would probably never fully recover. Rachel eventually apologized for the promotion situation, admitting that she'd been deeply insecure about her career and had been exaggerating her professional success to mask feelings of inadequacy and imposter syndrome. Her marriage had actually gotten stronger after she'd stopped feeling pressured to maintain false appearances about her achievements. Her husband said he felt closer to her now that she was being genuine about her struggles and insecurities. The neighbors gradually warmed up to us again as the initial drama subsided and people moved on to other sources of entertainment and gossip. Some of them even thanked us privately for exposing problems in their own relationships and families that they'd been ignoring or avoiding for years. Jessica's friend Monica eventually reached out to apologize for her initial reaction and said she'd learned valuable lessons about communication and boundaries in her own marriage from watching our experience unfold. A year after the transparency experiment, we were in a much healthier place as a couple. Our communication had improved dramatically, but within appropriate boundaries that respected both of our needs for privacy and autonomy. We shared feelings and concerns about our relationship without the artificial pressure of revealing every passing thought or momentary judgment. Jessica had learned to recognize her impulses to demand information and control through emotional manipulation, and she developed healthier ways to address her insecurities about our relationship. We both learned that radical transparency isn't actually intimate or relationship building. It's invasive and destructive. True emotional closeness comes from choosing what to share based on mutual benefit, not from being compelled to share everything. The experience had ultimately strengthened our marriage, but not in the way Jessica had originally imagined. Instead of bringing us closer through forced vulnerability, it had taught us to respect each other's boundaries while still being genuinely open about what truly mattered for our relationship. Looking back, Jessica admitted that her transparency demand had been less about improving our communication and more about satisfying her own need for control and her insecurity about my feelings for her. She'd wanted access to my private thoughts because she was anxious about our relationship, not because she genuinely believed it would create healthy intimacy. The radical honesty experiment had forced both of us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our relationship patterns, but it had also shown us the crucial difference between healthy openness and destructive oversharing. Dr. Martinez had helped us understand that the strongest relationships maintain appropriate mystery and privacy while still being fundamentally honest about important emotional needs and concerns. 2 years later, we still occasionally reference the transparency experiment as a cautionary tale about the difference between intimacy and intrusion, between healthy communication and emotional coercion. Jessica has become something of an advocate for healthy boundaries in relationships and often warns other couples about the dangers of radical honesty policies and transparency demands. She learned that pressuring a partner for vulnerability when they've expressed discomfort is a form of emotional coercion, regardless of the intentions behind it or the relationship goals being pursued. Our marriage is stronger now because we respect each other's fundamental right to privacy while still choosing to be genuinely open about our feelings, needs, and concerns when it feels safe and appropriate to do so. The experience taught us both that trust isn't built through forced transparency or demanded vulnerability, but through consistently respecting each other's boundaries while voluntarily choosing to share what strengthens the relationship. Jessica's family has found a new stability in their reconfigured relationships. Her parents' divorce was finalized with her mother receiving a fair financial settlement that secured her future independence. Her father has maintained his sobriety from gambling and has been working slowly to rebuild relationships with his children, though progress has been limited and may never reach previous levels of closeness. Rachel's career has actually improved since she stopped feeling pressure to exaggerate her achievements and started focusing on developing her genuine skills and interests. The whole experience became a catalyst for positive change in ways none of us had anticipated, though it certainly wasn't the romantic relationship transformation Jessica had originally envisioned. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd simply refused her demand for transparency instead of giving her exactly what she'd asked for in such a comprehensive way. But I think Jessica needed to experience the full reality of radical honesty to understand why emotional boundaries exist in healthy relationships in the first place. The experiment ultimately gave us both permission to be authentic without being brutal, honest without being invasive, and emotionally close without being codependent or controlling. That's probably the most important lesson we learned, that healthy relationships require both openness and privacy, both vulnerability and boundaries, both honesty and discretion in appropriate balance. 5 years after our radical transparency experiment, something unexpected happened that reminded us both of how far we'd come. Jessica received a message on social media from a woman named Sarah who had read one of her blog posts about healthy boundaries. Sarah explained that she was going through something eerily similar with her husband, who had become obsessed with radical transparency after listening to some podcast. She said her husband was demanding complete emotional openness while refusing to examine his own behavior patterns or motivations. Jessica agreed to speak with Sarah over video chat, and I listened from the kitchen as she patiently explained the difference between healthy communication and emotional coercion. The biggest red flag, Jessica told Sarah, is when someone demands vulnerability from you but won't take responsibility for their own actions. Real intimacy is mutual. It can't be forced from one side. Sarah started crying as she described how isolated she'd become, how her husband's demands for transparency had destroyed her relationships with friends and family members. It was like hearing our own story told from a different perspective. Jessica gave Sarah Dr. Martinez's contact information and offered to be available if she needed someone to talk to who understood the situation. After the call ended, Jessica sat quietly for a long time, processing the conversation. "I put you through exactly what Sarah's husband is putting her through," she said finally. "I can see it so clearly now, how manipulative and controlling I was, even though I convinced myself it was about love and intimacy." That weekend, we decided to visit Jessica's mother at her beach house. She'd been living there for 3 years now and had completely transformed her life since the divorce. She greeted us at the door with a genuine smile and a tan that made her look 10 years younger. Her house was filled with artwork and plants, and she had friends over for a dinner party that evening. "I never thought I'd say this," she told us while we sat on her deck watching the sunset, "but that radical transparency disaster was the best thing that ever happened to me. I was so afraid of being alone that I stayed in a marriage that was slowly destroying my self-respect." She'd started painting after the divorce and had actually sold several pieces to local galleries. She was taking cooking classes, learning Spanish, and had even started dating a retired teacher named Robert who brought her flowers every Tuesday. "I wasted 30 years trying to keep peace with someone who was never going to change," she continued. "Now I wake up every morning excited about my day instead of walking on eggshells around someone else's mood." Jessica's father had also made significant progress, though his journey had been much more difficult. He'd completed his gambling addiction program and had been clean for 4 years. He worked part-time at a hardware store and had moved into a small apartment near the coast. His relationship with Jessica remained complicated, but had improved considerably from the complete breakdown after our transparency experiment. He called her once a week now, and they could have conversations that lasted more than 10 minutes without anyone crying or yelling. I had to lose everything to realize what I was doing to my family. He told us during one of our awkward monthly coffee meetings. The transparency thing forced me to see myself through other people's eyes, and I didn't like what I saw. He'd paid back most of the money he'd stolen from the college funds, working overtime shifts and selling his expensive golf equipment and fishing gear. It had taken 3 years, but Jessica and Rachel's children now had their education savings restored. His affair with Linda had ended badly when she'd realized he was broke and facing serious financial consequences. She'd moved back to her home state and blocked his number, leaving him to deal with the fallout alone. I thought I was so smart, keeping all these secrets, he said during one particularly honest conversation. But I was just a pathetic old man who couldn't face his problems. At least now I know who I really am. Rachel had actually become one of the biggest advocates for our transparency experiment, though it had taken her nearly 2 years to reach that perspective. Her marriage had gone through a rough patch when her husband discovered the extent of her career insecurities and tendency to exaggerate achievements. They'd spent 6 months in couples therapy working through trust issues and communication problems. But ultimately, the crisis had forced them both to be more honest about their individual struggles and fears. Her husband admitted he'd been feeling inadequate about his own career and had been using Rachel's apparent success to avoid dealing with his professional dissatisfaction. We were both living these fake lives, trying to impress each other instead of actually supporting each other, Rachel told Jessica during one of their weekly sister calls. That whole promotion disaster was embarrassing, but it saved our marriage. Rachel had changed careers entirely, leaving the corporate world to become a high school guidance counselor. She said helping teenagers navigate their futures was more fulfilling than climbing any corporate ladder had ever been. Her new job paid significantly less than her previous position, but she and her husband had discovered they were happier with a simpler lifestyle that didn't require constant performance and achievement. Brad had become something of a local celebrity after his blog about workplace age discrimination gained national attention. He'd been interviewed on several news programs and had testified before a congressional committee about corporate practices that target older employees. His experience with our transparency experiment had given him the courage to speak publicly about issues he'd been afraid to address before. Sometimes people need a shock to the system to realize they're living in denial, he said during a neighborhood barbecue 2 years after the leaf blower incident. What happened with you guys was painful, but it woke me up to things I'd been ignoring. His wife had started her own blog about supporting spouses through career transitions and had built a significant following among women dealing with similar situations. They'd become closer as a couple by facing difficult truths together, instead of pretending everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. Monica had also experienced unexpected benefits from witnessing our transparency experiment, though she'd initially been horrified by what she saw as my cruelty toward Jessica. Her own marriage had been struggling with communication issues, and watching our crisis had motivated her and her husband to seek counseling before their problems became irreparable. Seeing what happened to Jessica made me realize how much we were both avoiding important conversations, Monica told us during a dinner party at her house. We learned to be honest with each other without being brutal about it. She'd become one of Jessica's closest friends again, and their relationship was stronger than it had been before the transparency experiment because they both learned to be more direct about their needs and concerns. During our 7th year of marriage, Jessica was offered an opportunity to write a book about healthy communication in relationships. The publisher had found her blog and was interested in expanding her ideas about the difference between intimacy and intrusion. She spent months working on the proposal, drawing from our experience as well as interviews with other couples who had struggled with similar issues. The book, titled The Intimacy Trap: Why Radical Transparency Destroys Relationships, was published the following year and became a surprise bestseller. Jessica appeared on several talk shows and podcasts, sharing our story and helping other couples understand the importance of boundaries in healthy relationships. She frequently emphasized that demanding complete transparency from a partner is actually a form of emotional abuse, regardless of the intentions behind it. Real intimacy comes from feeling safe to be vulnerable when you choose to be, she said during one particularly powerful interview. When someone pressures you for vulnerability, they're not seeking intimacy, they're seeking control. The book's success led to speaking engagements at relationship conferences and workshops around the country. Jessica found purpose in helping other people avoid the mistakes she'd made. One of her favorite parts of the book tour was meeting couples who had read her blog and avoided their own transparency disasters by learning from our experience. I get messages from people saying our story saved their marriages, Jessica told me after a particularly successful book signing event. It feels good to know that something positive came from all that chaos. Dr. Martinez wrote the foreword for Jessica's book, explaining the psychological dynamics that make radical transparency so appealing to people with control issues and insecurity problems. She emphasized that Jessica's transformation from someone who demanded transparency to someone who advocates for boundaries was possible because Jessica had been willing to examine her own motivations and take responsibility for her behavior. The transparency experiment failed as a relationship strategy, but it succeeded in forcing everyone involved to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. Dr. Martinez wrote, 8 years after our radical transparency experiment, we were invited to appear together on a major morning talk show to discuss Jessica's book and our experience. The producers wanted us to recreate some of our arguments for dramatic effect, but we declined, explaining that our story was about learning to communicate respectfully, not about creating entertaining conflict. Instead, we focused on practical advice for couples who might be tempted to try radical transparency in their own relationships. The biggest lesson we learned, I said during the interview, is that trust isn't built by eliminating all privacy. Trust is built by respecting boundaries while choosing to share what strengthens the relationship. Jessica added, I thought I wanted to know everything about my husband, but what I really wanted was reassurance that he loved me. Once I learned to ask for that directly, I didn't need access to his every thought. The show received thousands of responses from viewers who said our story had helped them understand similar patterns in their own relationships. Many people wrote about partners who demanded transparency, as well as their own tendencies to try to control relationships through emotional manipulation. One particularly moving letter came from a woman whose husband had been pressuring her to share details about her therapy sessions and past relationships. She said our interview had given her language to explain why his demands felt invasive and had helped her set boundaries that ultimately strengthened their marriage. 9 years after the experiment, Jessica received an unexpected phone call from Sarah, the woman who had reached out for help years earlier. Sarah wanted to update Jessica on how her situation had resolved and to thank her for the support during a difficult time. I left my husband, Sarah said during their conversation. He never stopped demanding transparency, and I realized he wasn't interested in intimacy. He just wanted control over my thoughts and feelings. Sarah had moved to a different state and was building a new life based on healthy relationships with appropriate boundaries. She said understanding the difference between intimacy and invasion had been crucial for her healing process. Jessica often reflected on how our transparency experiment had become a catalyst for examining toxic relationship patterns, not just in our marriage, but in our entire extended network of family and friends. It's like dropping a stone in water, she said during one of our evening walks. The ripples spread much further than you expect, and sometimes they expose things that needed to be seen. 10 years later, we celebrated our 15th wedding anniversary at the same restaurant where we'd had our first date. We laughed about how different we were from the couple who had gotten married with such naive ideas about what love and intimacy meant. I'm grateful for the transparency experiment now, Jessica said over dessert. Not because it was a good idea, it was terrible, but because it forced us both to grow up and learn how to actually love each other. I agreed that the experience, painful as it had been, had ultimately made us better partners to each other and better people individually. We learned that the strongest relationships aren't built on knowing everything about each other, but on trusting that what your partner chooses to share is genuine and honest. Our marriage had survived radical transparency, but more importantly, it had thrived after we abandoned it in favor of mutual respect and healthy boundaries. Looking back, the transparency experiment had been like performing surgery on our relationship without anesthesia, painful and traumatic, but ultimately revealing problems that needed to be addressed. We learned that love isn't about eliminating all mystery between partners, but about creating safety for voluntary vulnerability. The difference between healthy openness and destructive oversharing had become one of the most important lessons of our marriage. Years later, when young couples asked us for relationship advice, we always told them the same thing. Intimacy is about feeling safe to be yourself with someone, not about that person having unlimited access to your inner world. We'd learned that lesson the hard way, through crisis and conflict and the near destruction of our marriage. But we'd learned it thoroughly, and it had made all the difference in building a relationship based on genuine love and respect, rather than control and insecurity. The radical transparency experiment had given us exactly what Jessica had asked for: complete honesty about everything. What she discovered was that complete honesty without boundaries isn't intimacy at all. its invasion, chaos, and ultimately the destruction of the very closeness she'd been trying to create. But in learning what didn't work, we discovered what did work. And that knowledge had transformed not just our marriage, but our understanding of what healthy love actually looks like. Thanks for reading this extremely long story about what happens when someone gets exactly what they ask for. If you made it to the end, let me know what you think about radical transparency in relationships and whether you've ever been in a similar situation with unrealistic communication demands. Have you ever had someone pressure you for more honesty than you were comfortable giving? Or have you been the person pushing for radical transparency? I'd love to hear your thoughts on where the line should be between healthy openness and invasive oversharing. What lessons have you learned about boundaries and intimacy in your own relationships?